Morocco, with one of the world's oldest legacies of independent statehood. One of the world's most beautiful countries, with some of its friendliest people. And engaged throughout its history in an intense back and forth with its neighbor across the Straits of Gibraltar, Spain. At one point, Spain had ended up under the rule of North Africa during an era of Arab and Berber dominance in North Africa and Iberia. However, by the 16th century, Spain was one of the world's largest empires. Once the Reconquista of the Iberian mainland had been completed, the Spanish and Moroccans came to a bit of a peaceful understanding. By the mid-19th century, Spain's colonial empire was falling apart, all while the rest of Europe was now beginning to get involved in Africa. Spain needed to be there. However, without the strength to project across the continent, the easiest prey for the Spanish seemed to be a now weakened Morocco. Morocco was not some backwater, and it was not going to fall without a fight. Of all the foreign colonies in Africa, very few had the intertwined history with and physical proximity to the foreign power. If we're going to look at the history of Spanish Morocco, we're going to have to first take a brief look at the two remaining Spanish enclaves in North Africa, the cities of Ceuta and Melilla. Ceuta was originally a Portuguese city, and its now famous royal walls were constructed by the Portuguese in the 1540s. It first became associated with Spain during the 60-year-long union between Spain and Portugal. After this Iberian Union ended in 1640, Ceuta sided with Spain and was later formally recognized by Portugal as Spanish territory. It has remained sovereign and integral Spanish territory ever since, as indicated by the darker yellow color, same as the Spanish mainland. In fact, all of Spain's remaining possessions in northwest Africa are considered part of the Spanish state proper and are mainly Spanish populated. Meanwhile, Melilla fell into Spanish hands during the late 15th century. As Spain continued its Reconquista of the south, it established a fortress town in the Maghreb at Melilla, which would then become a bastion of the Spanish defense against Islamic raiders for centuries. An 18th century Spanish officer once reflected, quote, "An hour of service in Melilla, from the point of view of merit, was worth over 30 years of service to Spain," end quote. While this may have been a bit of an exaggeration, the city was dangerous, representing a frontier between Europe and Africa for centuries. So both Melilla and Ceuta have remained sovereign Spanish territory for hundreds of years. The Canaries were one of Spain's oldest colonies, dating back to the days of Isabella and Ferdinand. In fact, the Kingdom of Castile had made plans to conquer the Canaries even before the merger with Aragon. Not only was the colony successful as a sugar plantation, but it also facilitated Spanish settlement, the primary reason it remains an integral part of Spain. This is a similar situation to the English-speaking British Falklands, which we've previously discussed. As far as the present-day borders go, we only show realpolitik on this channel as part of the Apolitical World Map project. So if you're wondering how the Sahrawi state got into such a crazy shape, we will go into how this developed later in the video. The enclaves of Ceuta and Melilla may be islands of European civilization today, but throughout much of the 20th century, they were the home base for an entire civilizing mission, that being one of the publicly stated goals for many of the great powers' activities in Africa. Let's go back and take a look at the area at the beginning of 1860. Spain and Morocco were at war. The Moroccans had, in Spain's estimation, failed to exercise sufficient control over the peoples of the Rif Mountains near the Mediterranean coast, who had staged several unprovoked attacks on Spanish Ceuta. The sides repeatedly clashed throughout the Battle of Tetuan in February and March. The Spanish essentially had it won within the first 3 days, although it took until March 27th to secure victory. After a month-long armistice, Spain was granted concessions by the Moroccans. The Spanish received a new enclave along the Atlantic coast, which they would go on to develop into the city of Sidi Ifni. However, for the moment it was essentially just a strip of desert, and as such it was not made a part of the Spanish state proper. Instead, a protectorate was set up, with the aim of eventually developing into a Spanish colony, and ultimately perhaps into a part of Spain proper, but not yet. That's why it's listed in the lighter yellow color. Let's jump ahead 14 years to 1884. Hundreds of years earlier, in 1502, a papal bull was issued modifying the Treaty of Tordesillas, which had divided the Atlantic between Spain and Portugal, giving the rights to most territories south and east of the Canaries to Portugal. The modification allowed for the recognition of Spain's enclaves in North Africa as exceptions to this rule, including a new trading outpost at Villa Cisneros. Spain utilized this outpost on the so-called Rio de Oro Peninsula on and off for the next several hundred years, but with increasing European interest in Africa, a permanent settlement was set up in early 1884. They also resettled two other on and off trading posts along the Rio de Oro, Puerto Badia and Medina Gatel. By Christmas, the situation had escalated dramatically. Spain was part of the Berlin Conference, at which the great powers were divvying up spheres of influence in Africa. At this point, the Spanish Empire was weak, as it had lost most of its possessions in the Americas. Spain was no longer a power player on most of the world stage, and it would not be so in Africa either. However, France was developing into a major African power, and it encouraged Spanish expansion in northwest Africa, which was much more technologically and politically developed than the rest of the continent. Thus, France would need help from another power, and it was very willing to let Spain play the co-star role in northwest Africa. The day after Christmas, Spain officially requested the hinterland territory surrounding the three new settlements to be included in its sphere of influence. Spain immediately set out to secure this territory, with France bullying Morocco into accepting, as France by this point had diplomatic mastery over Morocco. France knew that it would need Spain's help if it wanted to further expand into the region. Plus, the French knew that Spain would never allow a French possession across the Straits of Gibraltar. Thus, France long-term had always envisioned Spain playing an expanded role in the region. Other than the now permanent settlement at Villa Cisneros, the re-establishments of Puerto Badia and Medina Gatel seemed like a bit of a ruse, legitimizing Spain's claims to the Rio de Oro at the Berlin Conference, but reverting to the status of on-and-off trading posts as soon as the territory had been secured. In any case, it had worked out for Spain, which now controlled the coastal strip as a colony. The name River of Gold is essentially a misnomer. When the Portuguese first came upon the area, they had been searching for the Senegal River, known as the River of Gold or the Rio de Oro to the Spanish and Portuguese, which is actually further to the south. However, Rio de Oro stuck as the name for the Villa Cisneros region. While rights to the region had been granted to Spain by the other great powers at the Berlin Conference, control over the Rio de Oro was still contested between Spain and local powers, namely the Sultanate of Morocco and the Mauritanian Emirate of Adrar. By the end of summer 1886, a treaty had been signed between Spain and the Emir of Adrar. According to Spain, this treaty saw the emir recognize the Spanish crown's rights to the Rio de Oro, diplomatically paving the way for Spain to signal its intention on the region as a whole, with the Spanish African coast being renamed officially Spanish Rio de Oro. Jumping ahead a little over 7 years to October of 1893, the Rif peoples were again making trouble for the Spanish, where they laid siege to Melilla. The Rif tribes only had limited association with the Moroccan state, which had little control over them. For the most part, they did not have modern weapons, thus the siege failed, and Spain turned things around in this first Melillan War with successful counterattacks, pushing the Rif raiders back from the town and ultimately placing blame on the Moroccan government for the violence. After the Spanish had crushed both the Rifians and the Moroccan regulars, the Moroccan and Spanish governments came together to sign the Treaty of Fez, at which Spain was granted another concession. And in fact, it could have demanded much more, but neither Spain nor France wanted to destabilize the Moroccan monarchy, at least at this point, as it served a useful purpose for maintaining order and for keeping regional tribes in check. Thus, all Spain demanded at this point was the interior portion of its Rio de Oro colony, almost all of which was at this point mainly open Sahara desert. Just like France was doing south of its Algeria colony, the great powers now had the capacity to control long stretches of open desert. The Spanish thus commenced the hunt for resources in their new territory, but also met stiff resistance from the local, mostly nomadic Sahrawi population, which, like the Rifians, had only ever paid lip service to local polities, such as the Sultanate of Morocco or the Emirate of Adrar, and were not prepared to recognize Spanish authority either. This resistance would not be organized, though, at least in the immediate future, and thus represented more an obstacle to the Spanish than a threat. By 1903, France had taken over Mauritania and incorporated it into French Senegal. Morocco was now isolated and surrounded by European possessions. The following October 1st, France consolidated its West African holdings into a super colony known as French West Africa. France, wanting to further isolate the Moroccan Sultanate, now pressed Spain's claims to Moroccan territory. 2 days later, Spain was granted an additional concession, another large desert strip north of the Rio de Oro, known in Spanish as Seguia Alhambra. It also formalized the interior border of the Rio de Oro. However, by March of 1905, that newly formalized border with Morocco was now instead with France, which had signed another treaty with Morocco carving up yet more of the Sahara and giving it to French West Africa. By this point, France and Spain had weakened Morocco so much that its fall seemed almost inevitable. Other European powers took notice, including the increasingly aggressive Germany. Germany had little interest in taking over Morocco directly, but it did have trading interests in the country, and it wanted, if nothing else, to extract a price from France for its influence over Morocco. This disagreement was exactly what the Berlin Conference had been designed to prevent, and as such it instigated a crisis that nearly began the Great War in 1905 over Morocco. The German Emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II, made an official state visit to Tangier, in which he voiced open support for Moroccan independence from France and Spain. With Europe on the edge of war, this became known as the Tangier Crisis. The tension continued throughout 1905, but Germany was unable to find the diplomatic support for war, and it never really wanted war anyway, at least according to the Kaiser. Wilhelm said he intended to extract concessions from the French, while also gaining their respect militarily in a potential wartime alliance. In this way, it's clear that the German saber-rattling was never really that serious. That said, German demands for some sort of compensation for French control over Morocco went mostly unhindered as an international conference kicked off to mediate the crisis in January of 1906. All of Europe now recognized what France had recognized earlier, that Spain had the most to lose in Morocco. Thus, Spain was chosen as host. The Germans only found support in their ally Austria-Hungary, with the whole rest of Europe supporting the French, including Spain, which already knew that it could rely on the French to give them the territory they wanted opposite Gibraltar. Had Germany emerged victorious from this dispute, and Morocco remained independent and under German influence, there likely never would have been a Spanish Morocco. The acts were signed on May 31st, with the Germans getting almost nothing that they wanted, although they were allowed to make several token demands of the French. Later that summer, France again forced Morocco to cede large portions of its interior Sahara Desert, reducing Morocco to mainly just a coastal region. Encroaching foreign influence now had Morocco completely isolated as an independent state. Spain also gained some additional coastline in a deal that ceded some interior portions of Rio de Oro to French West Africa. Throughout this entire time, the French had been wrestling for control of Casablanca with local and rebel groups. The international port city had representative of all the European governments present, though it remained under the jurisdiction of the Moroccan Sultan. The French, who had the biggest interest in Morocco, began building railroads and other infrastructure, sometimes destroying local historic or religious sites in the process. On July 30th, 1907, locals and rebels rose up and took control over the non-European portion of the city. Meanwhile, the French moved in and took control over the European quarter, sealing it off from the rest of the city. Then, when the French Navy arrived en route from Algeria, they began bombarding the non-European portion into submission. The city's Jews had fled to Tangier, while the remaining 1,500 to 3,000 inhabitants were mostly killed by raining shell fire from the sea. France's subversion of the Moroccan Sultan effectively left the state powerless, so no war broke out. Instead, the Moroccans effectively had to let the French keep the city. Any attempt to resist this would likely have meant a full-scale French invasion of Morocco. As France pacified the surrounding area and incorporated it into an enclave as well, it was clear that the French had pried open the door that Spain needed to be able to get involved. We discussed earlier why the French were open to this, but now it was going to become a reality. Spain began to get involved in Morocco proper, first with its involvement in a civil war toward the very end of independent Morocco. Back in 1902, Jalali al-Yusefi, a former secretary to the Sultan's brother, returned from exile in Algeria riding a female donkey, setting up shop in Taza in the valley connecting Algeria to Morocco through the mountains. Due to the French and Spanish influence on the Sultan, al-Yusefi declared himself to be the true Sultan of Morocco, calling himself Bou Hamara, the one who rides a female donkey. Bou Hamara first secured local control over the city of Taza, establishing a brutal regime of repression in opposition to the Moroccan government in Fez and the Alawite dynasty, whose legitimacy he challenged. He ruthlessly persecuted his opponents and the Jews, sometimes burning them alive in the middle of the night. In 1909, he began to expand beyond the rebellious city as the Moroccan Sultanate continued to weaken around him. He then exploited those weaknesses, including the lack of Moroccan defense in the Taza Gap. But as more and more tribes came into Bouhamara's realm, the more difficult they became to control or pay off. The various Riffian groups in the area did not take kindly to Bouhamara's regime. Throughout 1909, the rebellious leader faced rebellions of his own within his realm. The Moroccan government in Fez took advantage of this, sending armies after him throughout the summer, including the forces that captured Bouhamara's capital of Taza on August 22nd. Bouhamara and 400 of his men were taken prisoner and marched back to Fez on foot. Only 100 or so survived as they approached the city, and Bouhamara was thrown in a cage which was hoisted onto a camel's back, with Bouhamara's cage on full display as the procession marched into the city. Bouhamara was then executed, with some claiming he was thrown into the Sultan's lion's pit, while others claim he was executed in Russian style with a bullet in the back of the head. On the surface, it appeared that Morocco had gained some level of its sovereignty back. But hidden in the story of Bouhamara is the fact that he had granted mining concessions in northeastern Morocco to the Spanish. While this had temporarily helped Bouhamara boost his fledgling state, it now gave Spain a foothold in Morocco proper, where Spanish mining production in the northeast of the country could be closely monitored from Melilla. Local resistance to European influence in the country actually had the counter effect of increasing the Europeans' presence. In April 1911, a rebellion sprang up in the Moroccan capital of Fez against the Alawite Sultan Abd al-Hafid, partly over the perception that the Sultan had sold out the country to the French and Spanish. However, to preserve his own power, the Sultan had to call on who else but the French to come in and quell the rebellion. On May 11, 1911, French troops landed and occupied the present-day Moroccan capital of Rabat. From there, the French, combined with Moroccan allies and reinforcements from French Casablanca, crushed the rebels besieging the city of Fez, securing the continuity of the Alawite dynasty and its dependence on France. The French seized the Moroccan capital, crushing the rebellion just 10 days later on the 21st. Although the Sultan was still the head of a nominally independent country, Morocco had essentially been turned into a puppet of the French military, which now controlled the country's capital, Fez. The Spanish took this as a cue that it was time to start carving out their sphere of influence. On June 5th, Spanish forces occupied Larache and Alcazar. However, another French crisis with Germany over Morocco, despite this time being in the southern portion of the country, saw France force Spain later that year to put a pause on its expansion in northern Morocco, at least until the French-German crisis was over. After months of German gunboats docked off Agadir, the two sides came to an agreement on November 4th. Just like the 1905 crisis, the Germans extracted token concessions from the French in return for continued French influence over Morocco, this time also allowing them to retain their new possessions. For Spain, this meant that they would likely have to give up concessions in their area of influence in Morocco, as a parallel to France granting concessions in theirs. But any political or economic concessions were simply the price to pay for continued influence over the country. Meanwhile, a month earlier, Spain had formalized the protection of its mining interests, forming an army of native Moroccans to fight for Spain. Formed in Melilla and later expanded to Ceuta, the Fuerzas Regulares Indigenas were formed for this purpose. The Regulares remain active in Spanish Melilla and Ceuta even today. So at the start of 1912, the writing was truly on the wall for independent Morocco, with the Spanish as well as the even stronger French now encroaching deep into the Moroccan heartland. It was shaping up to be a year that independent Morocco would not see the end of. On March 30th, 1912, the French forces occupying the capital forced the Sultan to sign the Treaty of Fez. This treaty was essentially a self-immolation for Morocco's government. While the government itself would continue in operation, the Sultan was forced to go into exile in favor of a more pliant replacement. This allowed for the establishment of an official French protectorate in Morocco, uniting France's Moroccan possessions into a single political entity, nominally under the Sultan, with the goal of using the Sultan's legitimacy to extend French control over the rest of the country. However, this also had the consequence of declaring de facto independence for all the non-French areas of Morocco. These opposition states took different forms, with Ahmed al-Hiba appointed the new Sultan in the south, and the Zion Confederation of Berbers or Amazigh taking shape in the east. Now, Spain had once again been in conflict around Melilla and Ceuta for the past 3 years. This became known as the Second Melillan Campaign, which now also involved their new enclave in Larache. Finally, the Spanish would be allowed to expand this into full-scale conquest. On November 27, 1912, France and Spain signed the Treaty Regarding Morocco. This treaty officially partitioned Morocco between France and Spain. Like in the French protectorate, the Moroccan Sultan would retain jurisdiction over non-Europeans and would remain the nominal ruler under Spanish protection. By the end of the year, Spain had occupied its entire allotted territory along the Straits of Gibraltar, even though France had not attempted a similarly rapid expansion. That's because the Spanish did not pacify or consolidate control over these areas, which would come back to haunt them in the end. The Spanish were also granted rights for a protectorate in the southern part of the country, but at this point it was unrealistic to try to conquer or hold it. Spain already had enough trouble trying to maintain its Rio de Oro and Seguia Alhambra colonies in the Sahara. Spain had attempted to sell them to Austria-Hungary back in 1898, and in general they cost more than they were worth. Spain was not looking to add a third money pit in the Sahara, so it decided to wait to attack from the south until France had attacked southern Morocco from the north. This was the direction the French decided to attack first in expanding their influence. They saw the alternate Moroccan Sultanate holding out in the south as the most realistic target for immediate expansion, so the French attacked. By the end of 1913, the French had reached the outskirts of Agadir, and by the end of 1914, they had reached Ifni. Throughout 1915, the French and Spanish sandwiched the remaining opposition within the south of the country. With this, the Spanish now took control of the additional territory they had been granted back in 1912. This territory would become known as Cape Juby, based around the city of Viga-Benz. Remember, World War I was raging at this point, and France was even partially occupied by Germany. Spain was not involved in the war. They now had the manpower to consolidate the new territory, while the French couldn't spare the troops to make any further advances in Morocco at this point. Throughout the war, the Germans attempted to provide aid to the Zion Confederacy, but for the most part was unable to effectively pull this off. Once the Germans had been defeated, France punched through the Zion Confederacy and captured Taza. This was the decisive blow in the Zion War, as it was now just a matter of time before the remaining forces would be defeated. Then in June, French forces killed Ahmed al-Hiba, the pretender to the Moroccan throne, leader of the independent sultanate holding out, and commander of the so-called Blue Forces in the southeast. His brother, Merebi Rabu, took over as Sultan of the independent alternate sultanate, also known as the Blue Sultanate. All this time, the Spanish had figured that the extra manpower they were able to devote to the area had paid off already. They were not going through a complete pacification campaign the way the French were, and in fact had simply occupied and garrisoned areas to set up a protectorate without actually gaining control over day-to-day life. Given their previous experience with the Riffians, the Spanish wanted to let the locals run themselves while controlling the external affairs, but the Spaniards had greatly underestimated the will for independence of the Rif peoples. These Berber inhabitants had of course been reluctant to submit to the authority of the Sultan even during the days of independent Morocco. Now, under the former Spanish-Moroccan judge Abd al-Krim, the Berbers proved that Spanish control over the Rif was a complete farce. In late 1920 and early 21, they began to stage attacks on the Spanish, making their territory a de facto independent state once again. This kicked off the War of the Rif, in which Spain tried to reassert control over Spanish Morocco from the Rif Berbers. The principal Spanish figures in the region were General Damaso Berenguer, the High Commissioner of Spanish Morocco, and General Manuel Fernandez Silvestre, the Spanish commander in Melilla, and the favorite general of Spanish King Alfonso. Berenguer and Silvestre had trained together, but they were now at odds. Their power struggle during the Rif War would cost the lives of thousands of Spanish troops. Silvestre had to be somewhat deferential to Berenguer's position as High Commissioner, though he outranked Berenguer in the army and also had the favor of the king, meaning that Berenguer, even as High Commissioner, had no way to hold Silvestre accountable. Certainly neither man was leading from the front as the campaign kicked off in January 1921. Silvestre attempted to rapidly take back territory, building forts wherever possible and advancing further and further into the Rif. Krim sent Silvestre a letter, purportedly saying that if he crossed a certain river, that he would be killed and his men slaughtered. But his men did include 5,000 regulares. What would they do? Would the largely Berber force join their compatriots, or would they stay loyal to the Spanish crown? Silvestre was dismissive about the threat, with the Spanish media calling Krim, quote, a crazy Berber. Krim pulled his Riffian forces out of the valleys to allow Silvestre's forces to enter what was essentially a trap. The Riffians destroyed the Spanish supply columns, meaning that the manpower and time they'd wasted on the forts was useless as no food was able to reach them. The Spanish had now advanced hundreds of miles into the Rif with essentially no supply column. As they crossed the river for which Abd al-Krim had laid out as the boundary, where Silvestre and his men would be killed if they went any further, the prediction came true in at least one way. The regulares turned on the Spanish. By this point in the campaign, many of the Spanish troops had been injured or killed, and though still led by Spanish officers, the force was mainly comprised of regulares. When they finally turned on their commanders, the Spanish officers were killed to the last man, with the Riffians then fleeing to join the forces of Abd al-Krim. Silvestre had not gone there, but if he had, that part of the prediction would have come true as well, as it seems likely he would have been killed by the Riffians. This did not deter Silvestre from sending another force deep into Riffian territory. They took position at Iguriben and were cut off by the Riffians, who had continued cutting Spanish supply lines. The Spanish at this point were being ridiculed by the French, who accused Spanish commanders of failing to understand the intricacies of the Moroccan population, pointing out that their opponents were not some unintelligent people. Silvestre and even Berenguer did not train their officers properly, and they were more often seen spending time at brothels than at the academy. The same was true of the Spanish conscripts, who largely just wanted to go back home to Spain. That left the regulares, but they could not be trusted at this point in the war because of what had just happened. Amazingly, at this point, Spanish King Alfonso, living in the same fantasy world as Silvestre, sent his favorite general a message: "Hooray for real men," celebrating Silvestre for sending in more troops to Iguriben, even though they had been cut off. While Silvestre commanded from afar, disaster would befall these true men who were surrounded at the siege, nearly wiped out by the surrounding Riffians. The Spanish mistakes, however, didn't stop there. When he'd heard the force at Iguriben was surrounded, Silvestre sent in a relief force of 3,000 men. The Riffians, having already neutralized Iguriben, moved on the relief force and cut them off as well. That force was also cut down to a man, the third Spanish ambush defeat in 2 months. The last two had produced just a handful of escapees, only 2 of whom survived. On July 22nd, the Riffians attacked the Spanish encampment at Anual, where Silvestre and his headquarters were located. The Riffians attacked and skirmished with the Spanish early in the morning, before melting away into the mountains before the Spanish could respond in force. This is where Silvestre's bold ways finally came completely apart. Given the disastrous defeats already during the summer, Berenguer had at this point begun gauging support for a possible coup against King Alfonso, due to the monarch's continued support for Silvestre, seemingly no matter the cost. The king had backed Silvestre through defeat after defeat, but for the moment Berenguer decided that he was in no position to move, instead deciding to wait on events until Silvestre made another mistake. Silvestre made a huge mistake, the biggest one yet. He was spooked by the morning attack and ordered to retreat back to more secure territory. The hastily put together, disorganized retreat left the Spanish wide open to attack, and the Riffians were right there waiting as soon as they left the fort. The Spanish were in no formation to fight and were partially surrounded. The 5,000 Spanish troops, with Silvestre looking on, were a helpless mass, even against the lightly armed Riffians, who were not even that lightly armed anymore thanks to the capture of Spanish artillery. Silvestre panicked and ran the other way, reportedly yelling, "Run, run, the bogeyman is coming." Silvestre was killed either by his own hand or another, and nearly the full 5,000-strong Spanish contingent was cut down, becoming known as the disaster at Anual. The Riffians then began pushing the Spanish out of the forts they'd set up in the outer Rif valleys, as more than 10,000 additional Spanish troops would be killed in various battles through August 9th. The Riffians also took over 300 prisoners. Spanish King Alfonso would later ransom these prisoners back in 1923. But first, the Riffians declared their confederacy to be a unitary republic, the Republic of the Rif, on September 21st, with Abd al-Krim transitioning from the leader of the Rif Confederacy to the president of the Rif Republic, with much inspiration coming from the Turkish Republican movement under Mustafa Kemal going on at the same time. As president, Krim would negotiate that aforementioned prisoner exchange in 1923. In August 1923, the Spanish warship Juan de Juanes was sunk by Riffian artillery, prompting an explosion of Spanish outrage at home as Spanish soldiers refused to board ships taking them to Morocco, while many anti-war protesters and leftists waved the flag of Spain's enemy, the Rif Republic, whose underdog fight had captured the imagination of many. As the division intensified throughout the summer, the Spanish military knew that the situation was getting out of control, risking its position in Spain and Morocco. As such, on September 13th, King Alfonso backed a military coup by General Miguel Primo de Rivera. Primo de Rivera's coup had been inspired by Mussolini's coup a year earlier in Italy, which had also been a royal-backed attempt to restore order. Primo de Rivera was a military dictator, banning opposition and imposing censorship while attempting to shut down the leftists and anti-war groups. He promoted Francisco Franco to the youngest general in Europe and instituted a campaign of chemical weapons attacks to retake the Rif. In the summer of 1924, the Spanish began dropping a reported 1,200 mustard gas bombs per day on the Riffians. Meanwhile, the disasters of the Rif War left Spain with very little leverage for negotiating with France and Britain over the status of Tangier. On May 14th, the city began a new existence as an international city-state, guarded by French, Spanish, and British troops. Tangier was a great deal more successful than other international city-states of the era, such as Danzig or Fiume. Back in the Rif War, the Spanish were stuck in mud, and Primo de Rivera considered their situation to be almost hopeless. However, it would actually be Abd al-Krim that would open the Riffians up to destruction. On April 12th of the next year, 8,000 Riffians attacked the French border. The initial attacks devastated the French, who were caught off guard, with 2,000 dead or missing after this initial series of engagements. The French now agreed to help the Spanish destroy the forces of the Rif Republic. On May 8th, over 123,000 troops of a combined French and Spanish force invaded the Republic of the Rif. The French now also began using aerial mustard gas bombs. The outnumbered Riffians would hold on for over a year. However, a Spanish amphibious landing, one of the first in history, cut off the Riffian capital, Algiers, from the sea. The French and Spanish converged from both sides on the capital, forcing the surrender of Abd al-Krim. Although the bloody, drawn-out, and devastating war still bubbled up anger in the Spanish population, the lasting effects of Spanish victory could now be exercised, with Spanish Morocco now firmly back under King Alfonso's control. Back in Spain proper, Miguel Primo de Rivera had brought economic reforms, which saw the Spanish economy booming after the end of the Rif War for several years. However, the good times were running out by 1930. On January 30th of that year, Primo de Rivera, with the country now slipping into the Great Depression, resigned as Spain's military dictator after his military leaders showed him indifferent support in a meeting. King Alfonso replaced him as military dictator with Berenguer, who repealed the most hardline and repressive of Primo de Rivera's policies. His softer military dictatorship, the so-called Dicta Blanda, would last just over a year. Amongst continued and worsening political and economic turmoil, Berenguer resigned on February 14th of the next year. King Alfonso, growing more and more desperate, named Admiral Juan Bautista Aznar Cabañas as the successor. However, the king had reached the end of his rope. By early April, the king was informed that his popularity, including amongst the army, was severely slipping. As such, the only way for the king to continue to legitimize his rule was to call for local elections. These elections would be the first in 9 years and took place on April 12, 1931. Those factions in favor of a republic won the elections, holding the traditional separatist areas of the country, while also picking up votes from those who were anti-monarchist and those who simply did not like King Alfonso or the Bourbon dynasty. These Republicans were deadly serious, and 2 days later they demanded the resignation of the king and his prime minister. Aznar Cabañas duly resigned, and in came Niceto Alcalá de Mora, a pro-republic leader. Seeing the writing on the wall, King Alfonso refused to officially abdicate, but fled into exile, settling in the city of Rome alongside other deposed monarchs, where he would live for the rest of his life. With the army having grown so disillusioned over the last several years of the royal government, the change in regime did not have an immediate effect on the colonies. The army at this point remained loyal to the new Republican government in Madrid. The Republican government, though, was at best indifferent about the idea of having colonies, and eventually it was this lack of support for the army's interests in Africa that would help erode the army's support for the state. Meanwhile, the French were now finally advancing on the final pocket of Merebi Rebu's alternate sultanate in Morocco. In 1933, they had destroyed the final remnant of the Zion Confederacy, and by spring 1934, they had conquered the last territory holding out in Morocco. France's conquest was now complete, eliminating the last areas outside of European control in the region for the next 20-plus years. On August 29th, the Republican government made its first changes in North African policy, combining the Rio de Oro and Seguia Alhambra to form the Spanish Sahara. In early July 1936, back in Spain, continued political violence led to several high-profile murders and revenge killings. The army's response to this was to launch a military coup against the Republican government. This coup was only successful in parts of the country, though the military side, the so-called nationalists, did take control of the colonies. General Francisco Franco, who became the de facto leader of the Spanish nationalist movement after the failure of the coup in Madrid, invaded mainland Spain across the Straits of Gibraltar. Now, to this point, we'd been ignoring Britain's Gibraltar territory. It is just a fifth the size of Ceuta, which we've already exaggerated the size of a little bit. But Britain's presence now becomes important, as international politics would have a huge amount of sway in the region over the next decade. The nationalist forces under Franco hammered the Republicans in mainland Spain, while Franco's Army of Africa maintained full control over the Spanish possessions in northwest Africa. During the invasion of the mainland, Franco himself had been High Commissioner of Spanish Morocco, but now that Franco's state had a foothold in mainland Spain, he delegated his African command. On August 7th, he appointed Rafael Gallego Sáenz as the delegate governor of the Spanish Sahara, and on October 2nd, Luis Orgaz was appointed High Commissioner of Spanish Morocco. Franco's invasion of southern Spain turned out to be successful. He had set up a new regime, the Spanish State, with a power structure similar to that of Mussolini's Italy. Franco's regime changed the flags and symbols during the Civil War, eventually settling on a design similar to that of past monarchist flags, with the red-yellow-red pattern being brought back. In September 1939, World War II started in Europe, with France and Britain being heavily involved in the early stages. Neutral Spain, still rebuilding from the Civil War, found belligerents on all sides. However, the French colonies in Africa would be rendered mostly defenseless, as they were forced to bring the bulk of their forces back to France to defend against the Germans. Franco now realized that Spain had the opportunity to become the preeminent power in northwest Africa if the French were to be defeated. Although Franco was sympathetic to Hitler and Mussolini, who had each helped him win the Civil War, he was hesitant to accept any plan that involved Spain joining the Axis. Not only had it just gotten out of the Civil War, but Spain also had far too much to lose in terms of Atlantic trade. Franco demanded a price for joining the Axis, which included huge French concessions in northwest Africa. German leader Adolf Hitler hoped that Franco would back down on his demands once France was finally defeated and they came to the table. Paris fell to the Germans June 10, 1940. Spain marked the occasion by occupying the international city-state of Tangier on the same day, ostensibly to prevent an Italian invasion. By this point, Italy, Portugal, the Netherlands, and Belgium had joined Spain, Britain, and France on the Tangier Council. Spanish nationalists called on Franco to annex what they already were calling Spanish Tangier. After guaranteeing the protection of the international representatives in the city, the territory was annexed, not to Spain, but to Spanish Morocco on November 23rd. As he met with Hitler that fall, Franco used this as a jumping-off point to demand the large portions of French territory that he'd previously requested. Franco was essentially demanding that he be compensated for the potential loss of Atlantic trade, which would almost inevitably follow a Spanish entry into the Axis. He needed to be given a territory large enough and valuable enough to offset the difference, or to be given a guarantee of British surrender, and thus the end of any Atlantic threat. In any case, Franco did not join the Axis and did not receive the territories he requested, as Hitler needed to balance the interests of Franco's Spain with those of Pétain's France. Both countries were devastated by war, and at this point were simply trying to shore up their colonial interests. Germany essentially helped France and Spain keep their distance from each other, at least at this point in the war.
Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, donate on Patreon, and stay tuned for part 2 of our Spanish Morocco video. For now, thanks for watching. I'm Alex. I'm out.